Right now, if your house gets cold, you turn a dial. If the power goes out, you probably still have a phone flashlight, a gas stove, or at the very least, a neighbor with working heat. Fire, for you, is basically a background utility. It is always on, always available, and it never really goes out on you. For most of the Ice Age, that assumption would have gotten you killed. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about prehistoric fire. It was not a light switch. It was closer to a pet, something you had to feed, tend, protect from wind and rain, and sometimes physically carry between camps, because starting it from scratch could take an hour of work you did not have time for. And on the coldest nights of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, keeping that fire alive was often not even the plan. The plan was surviving without it. So how exactly did a mostly hairless primate make it through an ice age night when the fire wasn't burning? Start with what you'd assume. You'd assume fire was the whole strategy. Build it big, sit close, done. That's basically the cartoon version of prehistoric life. A roaring blaze, some shadows dancing on a cave wall, everybody safe and toasty until morning. And fire absolutely mattered. Nobody is arguing it didn't. But full-sized, roaring fires are expensive. They eat through fuel fast. And in the open steppe and tundra environments where a lot of Ice Age humans were living, fuel was not exactly abundant. There were no forests stacked with dead branches waiting to be gathered. In places like the Mammoth Steppe stretching across modern Ukraine and Russia, wood was often scarce or non-existent for long stretches of the year. So people did something that sounds almost too practical, almost too modern, to be prehistoric. They burned bone. At a site called Mezhirich, in modern Ukraine, archaeologists found the remains of dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Skulls stacked into a frame, tusks curved overhead like rafters, and hearths inside that show evidence of bone being used as fuel alongside whatever wood or dried grass could be scavenged. Bone doesn't burn like wood. It doesn't crackle and flare. It smolders. It's slow, smoky, and stubborn. But if the fat has already been rendered out of it, it holds heat for a genuinely long time. Which meant a fire built partly from bone wasn't really designed to blaze all night. It was designed to smolder all night. A slow burn instead of a fast one. Because slow was what you could actually sustain with the fuel you had on hand, and fast was a luxury you couldn't always afford. That's the first myth worth dropping. The image of a big Ice Age bonfire keeping a whole family warm until sunrise is mostly a modern invention, something closer to a movie set than an archaeological reality. What people more often built, especially deep in the coldest millennia, was a small, low-maintenance ember bed. You'd bank it, lightly smother it with ash to slow the burn rate, and let it tick over through the night rather than flame outward. Less dramatic, less warmth per hour, but a fire that would still be alive at dawn instead of a fire that burned hot and bright for 2 hours and quietly died at midnight while everyone was asleep and unable to notice. But a smoldering ember bed, on its own, does not heat an entire shelter through a sub-zero night. It just doesn't have the output. So what filled the gap? This is where the story stops being about fire at all and starts being about something far more interesting. The real MVP of Ice Age winter survival was not flame. It was fat, fur, and physics. Take the fur first. By around 40,000 years ago, humans had already figured out something crucial. Draped hides are not enough in extreme cold. Just throwing a mammoth skin over your shoulders like a cape might block some wind, but it leaves gaps everywhere. At the neck, the wrists, the ankles, and cold air finds every single one of them. What you actually need is tailored clothing, garments sewn to fit the body, trapping a thin layer of warm air against the skin instead of letting wind cut straight through it. We know people had figured this out because of a tiny, easily overlooked object, the eyed needle. Fine bone and ivory needles with a small hole drilled through one end start showing up in the archaeological record around this time, and they are basically a smoking gun for fitted, sewn clothing. Hoods, layered parkas, tight-cuffed sleeves, the works. At Sungir, a burial site in Russia dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, the bodies were covered in thousands of small ivory beads arranged in patterns that line up almost exactly with where sewn clothing seams would have been. Multiple layers, tightly fitted, probably including something not far off from what you'd recognize today as an early parka, complete with a hood. Ice Age humans, at least the ones at Sungir, were not shivering under a loose animal skin draped over one shoulder. Some of them were dressed, functionally, for a modern Arctic expedition, minus the synthetic fabric and the zippers. Then there's fat, which sounds almost too simple to matter, but mattered enormously. Animal fat rendered from a mammoth, bison, or reindeer kill was calorically dense enough to fuel a human body through a long, brutally cold night, when just staying warm burned through enormous amounts of energy on its own, without you even moving. Some of that fat also got used in small stone lamps, shallow carved bowls with a wick of moss or lichen, burning slowly enough to provide a little heat and a little light without demanding the constant attention a full fire needed. Lamps like this have been found at sites associated with the Gravettian culture across Ice Age Europe, and they suggest something worth pausing on. Light and heat weren't always coming from the same fire. Sometimes they were two separate, smaller systems, each doing a specific job, rather than one big blaze trying to do everything at once and doing none of it particularly efficiently. And then there's the part of this that has nothing to do with tools or technology at all. Bodies stacked together, generating heat for free. Human beings are, among other things, small furnaces. An adult resting body gives off a steady, reliable amount of heat, hour after hour, without any fuel at all beyond the calories already eaten that day. And Ice Age shelters were often built small and low on purpose, not because people lacked the skill or ambition to build bigger, but because a smaller, tightly enclosed space traps body heat far more efficiently than a large open one. Excavated dwelling floors from this period, including structures at Dolní Věstonice in the modern Czech Republic, show compact living areas, sometimes partially dug into the ground for extra insulation against wind, with hearths that appear to have run at a modest, sustained burn rather than a dramatic one. Combine a small, wind-blocked shelter, a group of adults and children sleeping close together under layered furs, and a slow smoldering ember bed at the center, and you get something that functioned less like a campfire scene and more like a shared human radiator. The fire was one heat source among several, and arguably not even the most important one. The people themselves were doing a lot of the actual work, just by existing next to each other. Here's the turning point, though, and it's a strange one. The more precarious fire was, the more it shaped how people organized their entire lives around it. Groups tended to camp near reliable fuel sources and defensible shelter, not just near food, because a good hunting ground with no fuel and no windbreak was a death trap in disguise. Fire maintenance likely became a specific, valued skill within a group. Someone whose job, at least on certain nights, was making sure the embers survived till morning, because a fire that went fully out in the coldest part of an Ice Age winter was not a minor inconvenience you'd shrug off. Rekindling from scratch with a hand drill or a strike-a-light kit in freezing, possibly wet or windy conditions could take real time and real effort. Time and effort you might not have if the temperature was dropping fast and daylight was already gone. So people built redundancy into the system on purpose, the way any good engineer would. Multiple small heat sources instead of one big one. Insulated, layered clothing that kept working, even if the fire failed for a few hours. Shelters engineered specifically to hold heat rather than just block wind. Fire was important, genuinely important, but it was never the only plan, because a species that had bet its survival entirely on one fragile flame would not have made it through repeated, decades-long glacial winters across multiple continents. The margin for error was too thin. And here's the genuinely surprising detail, the one that tends to get left out of the popular picture. Some of the coldest, harshest stretches of the Ice Age were also periods of real technological sophistication, not desperate, last-minute improvisation. The sewn clothing at Sungir wasn't crude. The engineering behind a mammoth bone dwelling at Mezhirich wasn't a lucky accident stumbled into by chance. These were tested, refined systems, developed over generations, passed down, argued over, improved, built by people who understood thermodynamics in a completely practical, hands-on way, long before anyone had a word for thermodynamics or a diagram to explain it. There's a tendency to imagine Ice Age life as constant, miserable huddling in the dark, everyone just barely scraping by. That picture undersells just how much precise, deliberate engineering was going into staying alive every single night, night after night, for thousands of years in a row. It's also worth sitting with how much coordination all of this actually required. None of this worked as a solo effort. Someone had to know how to render fat properly so it wouldn't spoil. Someone had to know how to cut and sew a hide so the seams wouldn't leak cold air. Someone had to track which fuel sources were nearby before the group even arrived at a new camp. So the whole plan wasn't being improvised in the dark, literally, with the temperature already dropping. This was a full system, held together by shared, transmitted knowledge, the kind of knowledge that had to be taught deliberately to children, tested against real winters, and corrected when it failed. Get any one piece of that system wrong. Badly fitted clothing, a shelter built in the wrong spot, a fire allowed to fully die with no backup plan. and the consequences were not abstract. They were immediate and physical. So the next time your heater clicks on without a second thought, or your phone flashlight saves you during a random blackout, it might be worth remembering that the fire you take so completely for granted was, for most of human history, the least reliable part of the whole system. Your ancestors didn't survive the Ice Age because they mastered fire and rode it out. They survived because they figured out, quietly and brilliantly, how to get through the night when the fire wasn't enough on its own. And honestly, that's a far more impressive trick than just keeping a flame alive.